Hello, everybody. My name is George Coutts, and I am a PhD student here at the Sophia Center. You'll have to forgive me, all of my thoughts live on my phone, so if I look it's because I'm trying to sort of keep the ship running on a tight schedule. So very quickly, I just wanted to talk a little bit about my research, which is focused on how astrologers handle ideas about gender, sex, and sexuality, both theoretically and practically through history, mainly keeping within the traditions that emerge from and circulate around the Mediterranean, including Europe, parts of North Africa, the Middle East, and then later North America by extension. And so in our time together today, we'll be headed back to the 2nd century Egyptian version of the Hellenistic world to meet Claudius Ptolemy and to talk a little bit about the Tetrabiblos and what it has to say about gender and sexual morality. Now, I get a lot of turned heads when I admit what I'm studying, non-astrologers usually wondering about the astrology piece, and then astrologers often questioning the gender piece. And so I want to take a moment to clarify that astrology has always been absolutely rife with sex and gender stuff, and it's important to not let it go unspoken about. And so just to cite my sources on this matter, I will defer to Bernadette Brady, who says that the work of deconstructing astrology, the work of deconstructing astrology to explore ways of removing or understanding gender issues within the astrological system will continue as long as society continues to explore the consequences of gender issues for humanity. And so before we go to Ptolemy for his take, really quickly, just let me run through some of what Bernadette and I, and now award-winning MA thesis writer Alejo Lopez, might be talking about here. So, theoretically, we've got the supposed masculinity and femininity of the signs of the planets, right? So Mars is one of 4 always masculine planets. Venus is one of 2 always feminine planets. And then we've got this curious third other thing in Mercury, who is either masculine or feminine, depending on the time of day. Then practically, we've got this idea that planets treat people differently depending on their sex or gender. And so this is the bulk of what we'll be talking about today, but you might also consider what Linda Goodman, writing much later in the tradition, and how she divides her interpretations of the 12 sun signs along gendered lines, right? So she writes, is it a flaming torch? Is it a bird, an explosion, or is it Superman? Well, practically, it's an Aries male, which is pretty close. And then she goes on to say in her next chapter, so you're in love with an Aries woman. I don't know whether to congratulate you or to sympathize with you. And so there's a question here, right? Why does she distinguish it this way? And then why do Aries males get to be Superman and we should be apologizing for Aries women, right? And then finally, sorry, where am I? Yeah, okay. And so we also have this abject obsession with using astrology to talk about romantic and other kinds of relationships, including sexual ones. And this runs through almost the entire course of the astrological tradition. And Ptolemy, to be clear, is no exception to this. So, for example, he thoroughly relies on gendered sex concepts to formulate his foundation of astrology in Book 1 of the Tetrabiblos. Here we see him using 2 gendered categories to justify the masculinity and the femininity of the planets. But then he also uses astrological techniques to explore regionally specific expressions of sex and gender in Book 2 of the Tetrabiblos, right? So he says, people from Eastern countries are more masculine, vigorous of soul, and frank in all things because one would reasonably assume that the Orient partakes of the nature of the sun. This region is therefore diurnal, masculine, and so on and so forth. And so we are brought to Book 3, Chapter 14 of the Tetrabiblos, called The Diseases of the Soul, where he writes things like, the corresponding perversion of the passive portion of the soul is most apparent in excesses and deficiencies in matters of sex, male and female, as compared with what is natural. For when these thus fall under observation, if the luminaries are unattended in masculine signs, males exceed in the natural and females exceed in the unnatural quality. And then he takes this logic and goes on to say things like, the males become addicted to natural sexual intercourse and are adulterous, insatiate, and ready on every occasion for base and lawless acts of sexual passion, while the females are lustful for unnatural congresses, casting inviting glances of the eye, and are what we call tribids, for they deal with females and perform the functions of males. Just in case it wasn't clear, he's talking about lesbians here. Okay, so some considerations for us moving forward. So in order to really hear what's being said in On Diseases of the Soul, we'll first have to talk about Ptolemy's understanding of what a soul is and its role in On Diseases of the Soul, before contemplating Ptolemy's choice to locate his discussion about sex in a chapter about diseases. And then finally, we'll talk about what Ptolemy is really meaning to say about sex here. And so, what is a soul? This is the Greek word that is used in the initial tradition. It's pronounced psyche. And what I've written here is that the first Homeric uses of the word that gets translated into soul refer almost entirely to some force that distinguishes life from death. But as the term develops from the 5th century BC onward, users of the word expand its meaning to the point that soul is also used to refer to the seat of emotions, desires, and moral sensibilities. And so this conception of the soul as both the source of life generally and the place where a person's feelings, attitudes, and behaviors get worked out is concretized in the works of philosophers like Plato, Aristotle, and later Stoic philosophers, all who in their own way provide the theoretical foundations for Ptolemy's conception of the soul in the Tetrabiblos. And so today I would like to focus our discussion on Plato, and moving forward we will hopefully see why. So, Plato outlines a tripartite model of the soul and uses the image of a charioteer and 2 horses to explain his meaning over the course of his Phaedrus and the Timaeus. So at the top of the chain, so really quickly, so we've got the body on one hand and we've got the soul, and then he divides the soul into 3. And at the top of the chain of the hierarchy of the soul, we've got the charioteer, who represents the rational soul, the mind or intellect, which discerns what is true, judges what is real, and makes rational decisions. Then we go a step down to what I'm calling horse A, who is the spirited soul, the active part, the will, whose function is to carry out what the reason has decided. And then finally, at the bottom, we have horse B, the appetitive soul, which is the seat of emotion and desire, which needed to be restrained by the higher rational soul, that's important, if the individual was to be saved from self-destructive behavior. And so, I'm going to keep talking. And so Ptolemy's definition of soul is tricky because if you were to ask him directly, what is a soul, he would have to return the question back at you and ask you, well, which one of my books are we talking about here, right? Because over the course of his writings, Ptolemy defines soul very differently. And so we don't have time to get into all of his definitions today, but as a polymath writing on a number of different academic interests, including astronomy, mathematics, geography, harmonics, optics, etc., it suffices to say that the ways that Ptolemy defines the soul will rise to meet the criteria of the subject that he is otherwise writing about. However, what seems to be common in all of his definitions is his reliance on Platonic in conjunction with Aristotelian and Stoic terminology, variously combined, again, depending on the context. And so, the definition of the soul he uses in the Tetrabiblos most closely resembles the Platonic tripartite model of the soul, but with the 2 lowest levels mashed together, so the 2 horses become 1 horse, which produces a dualistic soul with 1 active or intellectual part and 1 passive or material part. And so if Ptolemy assumes, as he does, that questions pertaining to the soul can be worked out on an astrological scale, where in the chart should we look for these answers? And he would say, in no uncertain terms, when talking about the soul, we need to look at Mercury and the moon. And so he doesn't go into too much explanatory detail on this matter, but he is otherwise very clear that the questions pertaining to the active or rational part of the soul, the charioteer, can be interpreted on the basis of Mercury's placement in the chart, where questions pertaining to the passive or irrational part, the horses, can be answered by looking at the moon's placement. And so before we move on, it'll also be important to recognize that Ptolemy holds that Mercury and the moon don't explain the soul's qualities in isolation. The way that they interact with the other astrological planets will ultimately need to be considered in order to draw up a final conclusion about the qualities and subsequent diseases of the soul. Whew, okay, diseases. Now that we have a better sense of what a soul is, that it is on one hand the animating force of life, and on the other the seat of desires and decisions, and that we've also covered Ptolemy's sense that the soul can be divided into an active and a passive part, both of which can be considered astrologically using the unique placements of the moon and Mercury in the natal chart, we need to talk about what he means when he talks about diseases of the soul. So at the beginning of the chapter, he explains that one might now, with propriety, call diseases those extremes of character which either fall short of or exceed the mean. So very simply, for Ptolemy, a disease is a quality of the soul that has become so disproportionate that it falls outside of the mean, or what's natural. And so we have to ask, what does he mean by mean? We're going to unpack this as we go, but I wanted to introduce the Ashmond translation of this same passage in the Tetrabiblos. So far, we've been using the Robbins translation, but Ashmond has a very colorful language. And so Ashmond says that Ptolemy says that every irregularity of the moral habit, whether by deficiency or superabundance, may be fitly termed a moral disorder. But at the same time, there are other disorders of so vast and manifold a disproportion that they quite, as it were, overpower the natural course of the intellect and passions of the mind. And so with that idea that a disease refers to a condition where the natural course of things is overpowered, right? Think earlier of the remark that we had made about the destructive potential of horse B if the charioteer should ever lose control of the reins in the Platonic metaphor. We are finally ready to move into the depths of chapter 14. And so as a part of first principles, Ptolemy ventures to describe diseases in the active part of the soul first. This is where he talks about epilepsy. So he says things like, those are epileptic in whose genitures the moon and Mercury are, as we have said before, unrelated to each other or the eastern horizon. They are violently insane when, again, under the same conditions, Saturn by night and Mars by day rules the position. And they are afflicted by demons and have water on the brain when the maleficent planets are in this position and control the moon in phase, and so on. And so for the purpose of this talk, we can't spend too much time here, but we should note that when Ptolemy talks about a disease in the active part of the soul, he is meaning to address any condition that affects the mind's ability to control itself. And so moving quite along, after he deals with our charioteer, so to speak, he moves on to talk about the corresponding perversion of the passive portion. And he goes on to say that the diseases in the passive portion of the soul are most apparent in excesses and deficiency in matters of sex, male and female, as compared with what is natural. And so before we get to the juicy bits of what he ends up talking about, I'd like to take a moment to muse on the definition of the word natural. So when I was starting my research for this talk, I was unpleasantly surprised to find that the Oxford English Dictionary includes 11 potential definitions of the word, which is too many. However, it affirmed my sense that pinning down exactly what Ptolemy means here is a difficult but ultimately very important task. True. And so I went digging, and I found an article by French ecologists Frédéric Ducarme and Denis Cuvier that tracks the semantic meaning of nature through history. In it, they explain, and with particular reference to Aristotle's use of the word, that nature is perhaps most effectively viewed as a pancreston, which is a term they borrow from Daniel Simberloff. That means a term that it means so many different things to so many different people that it is useless as a theoretical framework or explanatory device. Which was only very slightly helpful to me because ultimately it doesn't bring us any closer to understanding what natural means when Ptolemy uses it to describe modes of sexual behavior, but it does draw in the importance of context when aiming to define the word. So I kept searching for an adequate way to define natural when I found J.S. Mill, who offers 3 potential and I think rather useful perspectives on how we can interpret the use of the word nature. So the first thing he notes is that nature can mean the sum of all phenomena together with the causes which produce them, including not only all that happens, but all that is capable of happening, which seems good enough, but Mill notes that this definition doesn't necessarily cover cases where nature is conceived of as something which is opposed to art. So he moves that nature is not everything which happens, but only what takes place without the agency or without the voluntary and intentional agency of man. And so now once he lays out these 2 definitions, he confronts cases where nature is used in the development of virtue ethics and later Christian theology. He notices that any mode of thinking, feeling, or acting that is according to nature is usually accepted as a strong argument for its goodness. And then he says, conversely, the imputation of being contrary to nature is thought to bar the door on the part of the thing so designated to be tolerated or excused, which leads him to his 3rd definition of nature, which reads, nature does not stand for what is, but for what ought to be, or for the standard of what ought to be. And so after reading this, I had that little light bulb go off, because this sense of natural being used to describe what ought to be as opposed to what is makes Ptolemy's idea that sexual behaviors need to be weighed against what's natural make a lot of sense. And we'll hopefully see why in the next few slides. So we're back to Ptolemy with a very serious and important question about his use of the word nature in On Diseases of the Soul. The question being, what do you mean when you say natural? And so very simply, in matters of sex, male and female, as compared with what is natural, as Robbins puts it, or in light of the power of either gender to produce a conformation agreeable to its own proper nature, as Ashmond would have it, for Ptolemy, what seems natural is roughly that males should act like men who are naturally predisposed to penetrate, and females should act like women who are naturally predisposed to be penetrated. And so this is a little jarring to read, but I promise you, as we go through what he actually ends up saying, this is what he means. So I've made these charts. Basically, when he's looking at the passive diseases of the soul, he's telling you to look at the sun and the moon, where they're placed in terms of the masculinity or the femininity of the signs, and then look at how Venus and Mars interact, right? So males who have the sun and the moon unattended in masculine signs exceed in the natural where sex is concerned, and females who have the same positions exceed in the unnatural, right? So for males, the natural might look like, by implication, that they become addicted to natural sexual intercourse. They are adulterous, insatiate, ready on every occasion for base and lawless acts of sexual passion. For females, they become lustful for unnatural congresses, cast inviting glances of the eye, are what we call trivids, for they deal with females and perform the functions of males. And then when you throw Venus into the equation, they do these things secretly and not openly. And when you throw Mars into the equation, they designate the women with whom they are on such terms as their lawful wives. So it's not that they're just having intercourse at this point, it's that they're living together in a same-sex couple. And so what happens when we put the sun and the moon in feminine signs? So as expected, for males, they exceed in the unnatural. Their souls become soft and effeminate. For females, they exceed in the natural, clearly. When you add Venus into the equation, males, again, become effeminate. He's obsessed with males becoming effeminate. They are unsound with respect, with unnatural congresses, and are dealt with as pathics, though privately and secretly. Pathics here means that the pathic person in a sexual interaction is the person who is receiving penetration. And then when you throw Venus and Mars together, the men become shameless. Shamelessness is outright and frank, true. They are stamped with the reproach and insult that attend such usages. And then females who have the overabundance of these planets in feminine signs are depraved, adulterous, lustful, and may be dealt with in the natural manner on any occasion and by anyone soever. They refuse absolutely no sexual act that would be base or unlawful, which mirrors, we'll go back to what he says here. This looks very similar to this, right? So he's very clearly setting up a standard of what's natural. And so ultimately, a few things before I move on to my next slide. So you'll notice that Mercury, as a stand-in for the rational part of the soul, has all but disappeared from the equation here. So we're dealing with behaviors that have to do, or have nothing to do, with the thinking mind, but are more appropriately dealt with in terms of bodily desire. And then next, you'll notice, as we've said, that Ptolemy's sexual diseases all pretty much amount to behavior where men want to either penetrate too much or want to be penetrated at all. And this same thing applies to women who want to penetrate at all or want to be penetrated too much. And so the ideas that he presents here are standard in the Hellenistic world, importantly, and exist in the way that they do for three likely reasons. So the first being biological. I thought of putting up a slide here, but I didn't feel the need to explain to everyone here that in order for pregnancy to occur, a male must penetrate and a female must be penetrated. So that seems like a pretty solid reason for why this is the norm at this time. The second has to do a little bit with our horse and our chariot metaphor, as it speaks for the broader Hellenistic preferences for temperament and restraint. So the importance of the intellect restraining the body's desires and impulses cannot be overstated. As we mentioned again with our horse here, right? He is wont to cause self-destructive behavior if he cannot be controlled by the mind. And this idea stretches down through the astrological lineage to a renowned Platonist and my favorite astrologer, Marsilio Ficino, who includes sexual intercourse in his chapter, which is called The Special Enemies of Scholars Are Five: phlegm, black bile, sexual intercourse, gluttony, and sleeping in the morning. The point being here that bodily desires have the power, if uncontrolled by a rational and thinking mind, to take time away from mental pursuits and other forms of intellectual life. And so the third reason for why these standards exist the way that they do in Ptolemy's writing has to do with ideas about the social implications of sex and its place in the preservation of the prevailing Hellenistic social hierarchy. So philologist David Halperin, in his study of Hellenistic sexual norms, explains that in this socio-sexual system, all respectable sexual relations were necessarily hierarchical. Active and passive sexual roles were isomorphic with masculine and feminine gender roles, which in turn correspond to superordinate and subordinate social status. An adult male citizen of Athens could therefore have legitimate sexual relations only with statutory minors, his inferiors not in age, but in social and political status. The proper targets of his sexual desire included specifically women, boys, foreigners, and slaves, all of them persons who did not enjoy the same legal and political privileges as he did. And so to clarify, Ptolemy is working out what can be considered natural as opposed to unnatural sexual behavior against the backdrop of a Hellenistic social structure where sex was not a private quest for mutual pleasure that absorbed, if only temporarily, the social identities of its participants. It was rather a declaration of one's social identity, an expression of one's public status. It served to position social actors in the places assigned to them by virtue of their political standing in the hierarchical structure of the Athenian polity. Now, for me, as I hope maybe for all of you, the thought that sex is an arena for the confirmation of a social hierarchy that is based on the right of adult male citizens to exert dominance over women, young men, non-citizens, and slaves is questionable at best. And if you'll allow my personal opinion for a moment, I think that Ptolemy's incorporation of the Hellenistic idea that sexual behavior is only natural when it occurs moderately and between a penetrating male and a penetrated female or social political inferior, otherwise it is evidence of a diseased soul, is, to put it as diplomatically as I possibly can, suspicious. And if this all reads perfectly fine for you, please come and see me after class. We have something to talk about. But at the very least, I think you'd have to concede that this sense of what is natural when it comes to sex doesn't cover the entire picture of what sex can be. And so you could say to me, if we were having an argument, well, George, that sounds like an anachronistic judgment based on your modern understanding of what sex is. But then, because we're arguing, I would say, no, it's not. So after tempering my breath for a minute, I'd ask you if you'd ever heard of Sappho, the 5th century BC poetess who Plato called the 10th muse, who used erotic and otherwise sexual metaphors to describe her passionate relationship with the gods, specifically Aphrodite, whose passionate and lustful descriptions of intercourse between women gave rise to our modern use of the word lesbian, being that the term used to describe a woman who prefers sexual relationships with other women derives its etymology from Lesbos, which is the island where Sappho was writing about having sex with other women on. And all of this, again, was happening at least 500 years before Ptolemy would have characterized her soul as diseased. And so, to be clear, Sappho is one very small case in the broader point that I'm trying to make here, which is that Ptolemy's theory of what's natural in regards to sex represents a very small fragment of the entire picture of what sex is, even and especially within the Hellenistic world. And so I could produce truly a never-ending list of attitudes towards sex that are contemporary with Ptolemy that do not concur with his sexual model. And so if you would like to come and talk to me about it, I'll exchange emails and all that stuff. So Back to what's natural. Ultimately, the evidence presented here draws us into the conclusion that when Ptolemy uses the word natural in his theory about diseased souls, he's relying on definition of natural number 3. He's describing what ought to be. Because it is clear that Ptolemy doesn't contend against the natural existence of all kinds of sexual activities or postures in the first sense that describes what is, right? In fact, his implication that all manner of sexual behaviors can be deduced from looking at a natal chart implies that he believes all manner of sexual behaviors are ultimately caused by stellar influences, affording them natural existence. And so I suggest that Ptolemy, on the diseases of the soul, is accomplishing the following, right? He notes the existence of many different kinds of sexual activities and acknowledges their celestial origin before he clarifies his position on sexual ethics, his sense of what is sexually appropriate and what is sexually inappropriate, before he attempts to naturalize his sexual ethics by grafting them onto his theory of astrology, whereby he gives himself and other male Greek citizens a cosmically charged foundation upon which they can claim that engagement in a sexual behavior that falls outside the realm of what they hold as natural might just as easily be classified as a disease. And so I'll loop J.S. Mill back into the chat here with the suggestion that those who say we ought to act according to nature do not mean the mere identical position that we ought to do what we ought to do. They think that the word nature affords some external criterion of what we should do, and if they lay down as a rule for what ought to be, a word which in its proper signification denotes what is, they do so because they have a notion, either clearly or confusedly, that what is for them constitutes the rule and standard of what ought to be. And so as we begin to wrap this up, I want to clarify that Ptolemy isn't alone in his treatment of questions like this that pertain to the soul and what's natural for it. Again, it's a hallmark of Hellenistic philosophical treatments of the soul to position the intellect somewhere higher up than the body's desires in the hierarchy, right? So remember, Plato's charioteer is responsible for ensuring that the horses follow their natural course in the same way that the intellect is responsible for ensuring that the body follows its natural course, even, and in most cases especially, despite its desires. And so leading the horses through life, the charioteer must constantly be aware of every possible course, what is, while maintaining its commitment to choosing the right one, what ought to be. And so finally, the question remains, what is natural? And my parting thought is that, I don't know. But in any case, we should be very careful to question those who use it and ask them what they're really trying to say. Thank you.